This is my second part of a tutorial. In my previous tutorial, part one, I looked at how we gather data between census and why we go ahead and gather data. And you might choose to watch that if you haven't done so already in order to enable you to answer this question here. In this second exam question, we're going to look at a very common exam question which focuses on some of the issues about why it is difficult to gather reliable data in developing countries. Now, first thing I want to point out to you that is you should be careful and make sure you have prepared an answer for the difficulties in gathering data in developed countries, for example, the UK, because it is possible that you could be asked about this, although it's not such a common question as the difficulties of gathering data in a developing country. The second thing is it is an explained question, so be mindful your points need to be explained, and you must refer to a named example. Now, it can be just one or it can be multiple different countries. In today's lesson, I'm going to look at the one country, in this case, India, and talk you through a whole range of explanations and issues to do with trying to gather reliable data in a country like India. Right, let's just have a first thing is I would pause the video now and actually see how many ideas you can indeed write down. And then once I've gone through the rest of the video, see how many of your ideas match up with points that I outline. And if there's any outline that you haven't thought about, then you might want to add them to your own list. Okay, the first issue for a country like India, why is it difficult to gather reliable data? Because the population is changing so rapidly. There is substantially fast and rapid population growth, with high levels of children being born and not being registered, which makes it very difficult to accurately understand how many people are being added to the population any given year. Second reason is that conducting a census, for example, in a country like India, every 10 years is difficult simply due to the size of a country like India. Now, India's almost got 1.4 billion people, and conducting a reliable data gathering of that volume of people is incredibly difficult, as well as being very expensive, which means that it's going to be limited in terms of how accurately it's done in relation to maybe a developed country with a smaller population, as well as processing that data is going to take a long time, and therefore there might be a high degree of unreliability if a lot of the data isn't processed reliably. Okay, now let's have a look at some other kind of issues that are common in developing countries that can create problems. The first one is high levels of illiteracy in countries like India. So, for example, what we're really talking about here is people unable to read and write. And because a lot of census gathering is reliant on people filling out forms, if you can't read and write, then these forms are not necessarily going to go filled out. Now, you can develop this point into an additional mark. In order to get around this, what India's had to do is employ almost 1 million enumerators. Now, these are the people that go out into the villages and towns and cities across India and meet people face to face. And the reason that they need enumerators to do face-to-face meetings to fill out the census is due to the high levels of illiteracy and the fact that people cannot necessarily fill the forms out themselves. Now, that's an issue because that costs an awful lot of money to administer a census when you're needing this number of people carrying out face-to-face meetings. So that's a developing a point into an additional point. Another reason the data is less reliable is the number of people that live in informal housing known as shantytowns in countries like India. Now, here you could bring in a case study example of a shantytown in India that you might have studied, which is called Dharavi, which is a shantytown in Mumbai. The problem here is that people do not have fixed addresses and streets don't have names. It's very difficult, therefore, for the government to actually establish where people live in order to conduct a reliable census. Another reason for the lack of reliability is the sheer volume of languages, especially in the rural, more remote mountainous communities. India has dozens and dozens of different languages, and it does make gathering accurate data and translating that information into one common language, whether it be English or Hindi, much more difficult and time consuming. There is also quite a high level of distrust, especially amongst poorer communities, of the government, who might believe that the census is going to be used against them, or information that they provide might be used against them by the government. Now, whilst this isn't probably the case, it does create a degree of fear in those communities, and therefore a number of people might be inclined to lie or even avoid completing the census when the enumerators come around to gather the data. Another issue in a country like India is that there might be conflict in the northeast of the country in a province called Rajasthan, beg your pardon, in an area called Kashmir, not Rajasthan. There has been ongoing conflict between different communities, and at times this has made the environment very dangerous for people to go into that particular area of India. Now, you don't need to explain why there is conflict in Kashmir. That's spelled Kashmir. What you do look to say is that this means that gathering accurate data is going to be difficult, partly because people are not going to want to enter that area to gather that information, but secondly of all because these communities are often in turmoil and on the move due to this ongoing conflict. So it's unlikely you're going to get accurate and reliable data from this particular area of India. Another issue is the fact that India has some very remote communities, especially in the Himalayas in the north. And accessing these remote communities is very difficult and very time consuming. And it's likely that people in these areas are not going to be effectively counted. Another issue is because large numbers of people in rural areas work in agriculture for long periods of day, 7 days a week. And therefore, when the enumerators arrive, it's often the case that there may not actually be people around at home to complete the census, and nor are they necessarily going to be inclined to complete a form left at their home afterwards, especially if they live in these remote communities. So many of these more remote communities, especially agricultural ones, are not going to be counted for that reason. Okay, I've gone through a whole wide range of reasons, and each time you raise a point, all you need to do is revise a bullet point idea, but when it comes to actually talking about it, you need to explain how that issue influences the quality of data, or in this case, the reliability of the data that is looking to be gathered.